Hi there, this is Popo, I hope you're fine. Welcome back to the Matches in New Era tournament, round 1. And today we're going to review the two games played between CommanderXar and Gluttony. So let's get started. Okay, so for the first game, CommanderXar gets the white pieces with the Goblins faction, and Gluttony gets the black pieces also with the Goblins faction. Why? Because Gluttony is actually playing a very special role in the tournament, which is the doppelganger. So he would always match the faction he would have in front of him. So technically, when you play matches, you just expect to play some games between two different factions. But because of the rule of Gluttony, every game he would play would be a mirror match. So this means here, for example, the two player plays the same faction. So they have the same strength and the same ability, which is very interesting actually. So what are actually the Goblins? The Goblins is a faction that allows you to murder the enemy king. So each piece is itself slow, but they have some abilities that helps to target even more the opponent's king. You see, for example, that every king has a very small heart with 12 lives. This is because of the curse of the troll piece at the beginning of the game. Every time you would check the opponent's king, he would lose 1 life. And when the count drops to 0, then the opponent's king has lost the game. So there's another way to win the game. So perpetual check doesn't work here in this faction. You can just murder your enemy king. So that will be very interesting to witness. So the game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e6, the French defense, Croc to f3, pawn to d5, Croc to c3, Croc to f6, and Gremlin to d3. Okay, Gremlin to d3 is a move, but that maybe can be better if you just push here, or even if you decide to trade the pawns. There are some complicated variants here, but okay, Gremlin to d3 is played. We have pawn to a6, short castle, and Gremlin to c5. So here we have troll to e2, short castle, and now CommanderXar chops with the Croc to e5 and tries to get some squares. Actually here in this position, Gluttony wants to change a little this Croc because basically his development is not finished, so he tried to gain some time. So Croc to d7 is played, trying to challenge the Croc, and if the Croc takes, then one piece would develop and one piece which I've already played twice would vanish off the game, and that would give a little advantage in terms of speed for Gluttony. And this is exactly what happens because we have Croc captures d7 and Gremlin takes d7. So maybe capturing wasn't the best idea, but yeah, this is hard to deal because do you want to get back on the position? This is not that comfortable. So I can understand why this has been traded. Even I would personally go back and try to get for something else. Also, allowing the Gremlin goes to c5 is really annoying because I would able to go some mess. So maybe a move order with, for example, pawn to a3, then pawn to b4 would be interesting to put the Gremlin away. And then on this position, if the Gremlin wasn't here, you could just have played this, and then you would get a lot of initiative to develop your piece later once this is gone. So yeah, Croc captures d7, Gremlin captures d7, and now we have pawn to a3. Little late, but better late than never. So Gremlin to c6 is played. Here I see that it goes with a lot of pressure upon this pawn. Okay, is there something better to be played? I don't know. For example, here I see that this route is pretty passive. So that would be interesting later on to have played, for example, some move like Gremlin goes here, and then try to push this pawn and try to match forward with the pawn. But also, Gremlin to c6 also works, I mean. So we have troll to f3, so try to get a little better. Here, what a move would be interesting here to play would be a pawn to e5, because let's say after the Croc decides to go back, then the troll would be able to get further into the position. But you have to also be very careful because, for example, after this, the Croc has a special ability which allows him to walk very calmly one square in the direction of the enemy king. so it would be able, for example, to slide it this way, or even slide this way. And okay, the Croc is not retreating back. You see that they are much forward somehow. So we have troll to f3, pawn captures, the Gremlin captures, Croc captures, and troll captures. So you see that there's a big simplification, and we come closer to an endgame. Here, that's pretty sad that there will be an exchange, because somehow you want to keep your pieces in the game and try to sneak into the position. Just you to know, there is a special ability with the Gremlin, which allows him to teleport, to move or capture in front or behind the enemy king. So somehow he can strike one day to this square and try to get a big mess going on the board. But with this massive trade, this can't be real possible, because you would lose too much material. But if the troll would be able to go here and you go just there, then the game would be slightly more interesting here. We have troll to d5, so trying to get an attack here. And what's very interesting is that this position, you have to be very careful about it. Because if you go here and trying to match this, remember that the opponent can try to kick you, and once it kicks you, then this is also possible the other way. So here we have pawn to d3, which is played, but here Gluttony takes a chance and decides to trade the troll, because now the root takes the open file. The root is a very interesting piece, because here it acts like a rook to other pieces except for the king, because it can check the king like a regular queen type unit, of course range 3 also. But yeah, this is a deadly piece in the game to give the final blow to the king, so each king have to be very careful. So we have Gremlin to e3, although I don't really like this move. I think you need to keep the Gremlins on the board. Maybe one interesting move it would be to play the king here and try to push the pawns, get the route out. Or maybe you can try to kick the Gremlin, even he could be able to go here. So I don't know, maybe play this and this, play on that square, make the life on the Gremlin not cool, and then develop the Gremlin here, I don't know. So here a Gremlin to e3 is here, and it allows of course this exchange and this double pawn on the e file, which is not very nice to look. So now we have rook to d6, so basically Gluttony gets the position and is up to make some big attacks. And now we have rook to d1 opposing rook to d8 and pawn to b4. Okay, pawn to b4, this is a move that I don't really like, because it allows somehow to weaken this a3 pawn, and later on, if this pawn dares to move, maybe this move would be possible and would attack 2 spots at once. So we have pawn to b4, and now we have rook to c6 with a very concrete threat of attacking this pawn. So you have to defend, for example, with the rook going here, and okay, I mean, if it decides to go further into the position with the opposition of this, I don't know, then you play the rook here and you try to hang out. But here rook to f2 first is played, so it allows rook to d6, and after rook to d4 trying to get the opposition, rook to c3 is played. And now you see that both pawns are attacked, and this is almost impossible to defend, so the rook slides back to d3, and after rook captures, pawn captures, and pawn rook 3 captures, then Gluttony is up a pawn and is going to up a second pawn. So here in the position, rook to e2 is tried, but now rook takes f3 is played. So yeah, this is side, you see that this rook is not well placed, so yeah. So after the capture here, the rook gets to d2, try to get the open file and an attack, but now we have rook to c3, king to f2 defending the pawn which was attacked. So now the rook gets to c4, and now he wants to attack this pawn, and the only way to defend is to play rook to d4. I mean, you don't want to play this here, else you're going to have this pawn taken. So pawn rook to d4 is played, and then rook captures, pawn captures, and Gluttony is up 2 pawns. And you see that the way the pawns are isolated compared to the very nice structures of Gluttony would be decisive in the endgame. So normally the game is completely won for black if he plays very well. King to f8, king to e3, king to e7, pawn to d5. I don't really like this move, pawn to d5. Basically, you try to get the slow as possible, and you don't want to get an exchange, else you will be isolated here, because after pawn to d5 you have pawn captures, and you see that the control of this square f is done, and now you have to mobilize your king to defend this isolated pawn, and you have 3 pawns against 1 and 3 pawns against 2. So basically the game is over for you. King to d6, king to d4, pawn to b6, pawn to g4. Yeah, what can else you do? Like, you accelerating the process, but you lost anyway. So pawn to a5, so technically you have to exchange here, so pawn captures, and now this is pass pawn matching forward. So king to c4 is played, but now pawn to g6 prepares some kind of ugly pawn to f5. Now you have pawn to h4, which is played, I don't know why. Pawn to f5, pawn captures, and now 2 pawns marching forward, you can't stop them at once. So the king has to make a choice, and now king to b5, pawn to f4, king takes a5, pawn to f3, so now the king tries to run, I don't know, king to a6, pawn to f2, king to b7, and rook to f1, so this is the pawn promoting to a root. So king to c8, king takes d5. I mean, we don't really care. Maybe the king wanted to take and then get the square here to just... Okay, I can understand. So after king captures, rook to f4 is a check, because remember it acts like a queen towards the enemy king. So king to d7, I mean, you don't have a lot of options. Even if you try to get here, you're just going to be hunted down. So this can be understandable. And I see here that on the line is there's a, okay, so now the time shifts to 11, so it was stuck to 12. So king to d7, and after this rook to f6 is played. Okay, I mean, playing here the rook to f7 was also possible, because here, for example, let's say the king decides to play on c8, then you just have to play king to c6, and then even if you try to escape, then there's check and mate. So there's no way to survive this. So anyway, in the game, rook to f6 is played, king to e8 is played. I mean, you can try to get here, but king to e8, king to e6, you see now that the white king is stuck, and unfortunately he still has a pawn, so pawn to h5 is false, and after rook to f7 check and king to d8, you have the final rook to d7 checkmate, and this is in move 47 that Gluttony won the first game. So unfortunately, you won't be able to witness more of the Goblins' ability, but you see that root on the endgame is very deadly, and it leads to a very, very short kind of endgame situation where you mate very quick with the rook type unit rather than the other factions. So this was for the game 1, I don't have much to add, so we're going to see game number 2, which is a little more interesting, so we're going to witness it now. Okay, so for the second game, now Gluttony gets the white pieces and CommanderXar gets the black pieces. Both players play with the Mandrake faction, and this faction is very cool because it allows you to get better control on the center, but also to get some kind of odd coordination between your pieces, so you're going to witness this on the game. This faction also works during a sun and moon cycle. You see that there's a small moon on the king's head, and it just indicates you in which cycle you are. Every 5 moves, the cycle would alternate, and basically the small icon shows how many moves are left to play in the cycle. So depending on the move you are, some abilities would trigger or not. And the transition between 2 cycles can lead to very interesting tactics. So we'll see how it goes. The game starts with pawn to d4, we have pawn to d5, chomp to f3, chomp to f6, pawn to e3, pawn to e6, dread to d3, dread to d6, and castle, castle. So far, the game is symmetrical, but you see that in the last move, we now go into the sun cycle. And now it gets very interesting because one of the pieces has an ability with this, which is the Dryad. The Dryad can decide on this move to teleport on every center square of its color. So you see that all the yellow squares are squares where it can decide to teleport, but not to capture, just to move passively. So very interesting. So Gluttony takes a chance and decides to teleport the Dryad on g5, and now it pins the chomp for the nymph. So here in this position, we have pawn to h6, and this move is pretty interesting because it kicks basically Dryad, but the Dryad is only range 3, so basically if it goes here, there is no pin anymore, so the Dryad doesn't have enough of a good compensation, and the chomp can move freely. So this is why in the game Gluttony decides to exchange the Dryad for the chomp, and now after the nymph recaptures, we have pawn to h3. Okay, chomp to c6 is played, and now we have pawn to a3, so be sure that the chomp will never get here to get the Dryad. Here the position of the Dryad is pretty interesting. We have both to e8, chomp to d2, Dread to f5, and now it asks basically for a trade. So remember here we still are in the sun cycle, so the Dryad decides to teleport to f5. So we have captures, and now the chomp goes to h2. So the idea is that chomp would reroute, and also we'd get this very nice move here. So we have bulb to d8, pawn to f4, nymph to g6. So here actually there was a threat of queen trade. You see, on the moon cycle, the nymph can decide to capture any piece that just is surrounding the chain of pieces it creates connected with the nymph. So, for example, this nymph is connected to this, which is connected to this, which is connected to this. And just surrounding this, there's a nymph here. So the nymph could capture the other nymph here. So you'll see that this is the odd way of coordinating the pieces. So here, CommanderXar doesn't want to get exchanged, so he plays nymph to g6, and it allows chomp to g4, and suddenly the position improves. But we have pawn to h5, immediately kicking. So chomp goes to e5, and now we go almost in the same cycle, and there's the start of an exchange. So we have Dryad captures e5, and here you could have captured with the pawn and then just slide the pieces. But here on the game we have the chomp capturing e5. So you see that this is very weird, because we are in the sun cycle, and the chomp can capture on any of these 4 squares during the sun cycle. So you see, that's a way to control the center. So we have chomp captures e5, chomp captures, and pawn captures. Again, keeping the chomps on the game would be much interesting, because as I see here, this chomp doesn't do a lot of stuff and has to reroute a little, but this chomp also has to reroute, and it would be maybe faster than the other one. So I don't know, I would be much interested here. But anyways, after the big trade, we are still in the sun cycle, and we have the bulb going to e7. Now we have nymph to d2, so preparing to reform some kind of structure when the moon cycle would go eventually back. And we have a pawn to b6, which is played. We have bulb to e1, pawn to c5, changing the center, pawn to c3 defending, pawn to c4, bulb to f3, and bulb to d7. So the game gets pretty drawish, I would say. But for me, because here the position is slightly more open, white gets a concrete advantage. So what black should do is just to retreat the nymph, play g6, and try we can keep the king on the way, but hiding the king this way can be interesting, or he can just put the king away and try to break through with this. Because even the nymph is here, one of the bulb is not correctly placed. Even you see that it can be the case in some cycle. So king to h2 is played, which is a very bold move. I guess the idea here is that it wants basically to push the g4 pawn. We have pawn to b5, pawn to f1, pawn to a6. Here pawn to a6 somehow, it would be interesting to play immediately pawn to a5 and look later for this kind of move. Okay, so pawn to a6 played, bulb to g3 attacking the nymph, and the nymph goes to h6. Now we have bulb to f4, so you see that white is improving its position, and somehow black has to be very careful. One move to be played here is to play g6, to be sure that would never be a problem here upon this h5 pawn, because if the pawn falls, then the wall position cracks down. But here in the game we have a bulb to c7 played by CommanderXar, and after nymph to f2 we have pawn to h4, which is for me a big mistake. This pawn is basically dead. Okay, of course it attacks the bulb on the time, but there's too much pressure with these two bulbs, with this nymph, and you don't have enough of maybe a pawn and a nymph to defend all of this. So we have bulb to g4 and then pawn to g5, and you see that now the weak point goes here on this. So you basically have, for example, on the moon cycle, just to put this here, and then it threats to capture thanks to the chain. And also, defending with this pawn is pretty hard, because this can be attacked also. So the position worsens little for black. And we have bulb to f6, which is a very big punch in the position, because now the nymph is attacked and it has to retreat back. And where do you retreat the nymph? You have to be very careful, because this is attacked, and yeah, if you decide to go here, you have to be careful, because there's an ugly tactic going on. We have nymph to g7, and now nymph to f3. And here on this move we have bulb to c6, which is played. So this move can be seen as interesting because there is specialty ability of the bulb. On the sun cycle, the bulb on the center ring of the square, so all of this square, can decide to cross their own pieces. And you see it can capture the bulb and get an exchange. But even though there's a problem for now, because if captures, then pawn recaptures, and this is a fall. But here, this move was also a big blunder. Because now, there's this ugly move which has been played by Gluttony, which is bulb takes g5. It looks that this is a sacrifice of a bulb, and it pins the nymph. But actually, on the next turn, it goes to the moon cycle. So after the nymph is forced recaptured, this nymph can now connect to this, connects to this, and capture this way. So now we have the nymph capturing g5 with check, and in this position, basically, black is lost. So we have king to f8, which is played, and now nymph captures h4. I mean, here this is still the moon cycle, but what could be interesting is to go directly for the attack here, because here it buys one move. So for example, if you play here, let's say, now you have to be very careful because there's a threat of mate just there. So you have to just move the bulb away. Let's say you decide to move the bulb away here, and then you can play this very nice move with nymph to h8. But then the king would be forced to run here on e7. And as this is still the moon cycle, then you can decide to take an advantage with this and play, let's say, the nymph to g7, and that will be check because it connects just there. And you see that going on, you get more and more squares. If you decide to put the king here, then you simply take and basically you're normally winning. And if you decide to go here, then this just slides back here, and then you try to get any compensation, and when the king decides to get back here, then you just have to capture and the endgame is completely winning. So this move was a little more interesting, I guess, in my opinion. But nymph captures h4 is played, and the game continues. Pawn to a5, we have nymph to h5. I don't know again what this move is for, but maybe it threats to get a checkmate here. So we have a king to e8 already escaping, we have pawn to g4, pawn to b4, pawn captures, and pawn to g5. Pawn captures c3, pawn captures c3, and because this is the sun cycle, now the bulb takes on c3. But for me this is a little too late, because now the pawn goes on g6, and after pawn captures and nymph recaptures with check, the king goes on d7. I mean, the king could decide to go here, but this looks a little scary after this, because the king would be forced to go here, and the nymph can have some control. Remember that the moon cycle is never far away, and if the nymph has the chance to stay connected to the chain, it can just capture the bulb right after. So after king to d7, then we have a bulb to f7. Yeah, it can be interesting. I'm also wondering if there was some better move with the pressure of this, but after a past analysis, I didn't find something much of this. So the basic exchange is worth it. So bulb take to f7, so basically the bulb is dead. Maybe you could try to get a move with capturing this and trying to get the promotion, but here rather bulb captures, maybe this is a little inaccurate, and after nymph captures with check with king to d8. Here, maybe you can consider here going here and try to hide the other way and try to just go for the pawn. But at the same time, because it would capture here, the other pawn is much forward. I mean, you're losing this position, but you try to survive as you can. So king to d8 is played, and after nymph takes e6, we have bulb to c2 check. And what's the saddest part is that you can't even take here because the nymph is still connected and this is a moon cycle. So we have bulb to c2, this is not check. Nymph takes d5 with check, king to e8, king to g3. So wanted to escape check somehow, but I guess just pushing the pawn here seems sufficient here. But anyways, king to g3 is played, pawn to c3, pawn to e6, and now basically you have no way to escape. I mean, you can try to go here, but after the nymph going here, you don't have any way of countering this. I mean, you can try to get this, then check, you decide to go here, then the pawn marches forward, and this is checkmate on the next move. The position is completely losing. So actually CommanderXar decided to resign on the spot, played bulb c1, and then after nymph to d7 and king to f8, this is on move 47 again, that Gluttony makes the final blow with nymph to f7, which is checkmate. So This was a pretty sad game with this nice tactic. So basically, the game starts to be drawish, even though White gets a small advantage, and then it just concludes with this very nice tactic of switching between two states of cycles. So I hope you liked these two games. We're going to see each other next time with the next encounter of this round 1 of the Matches New Era tournament. See you then. Bye.